Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 19th presentation in the Virtual History Series presented by Baltimore Heritage and the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. I am Margaret Stella, Programs, Research, and Publications Manager for AIA Baltimore and the BAF. Thank you to everyone who donated to be with us this week. We have now been hosting Virtual Histories for 6 months. Your support enables us to provide these for free each week. A few announcements before we get started. Next week, we are kicking off Doors Open Baltimore with Aaron Henkin, discussing the award-winning Out of the Blocks on WYPR. And throughout October, we will have special Doors Histories. On October 9th, we will go on a tour of the Lily Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum. Then on October 16th, we'll explore Bromo Seltzer Tower. And finally, on October 23rd, we will learn about the award-winning transformation of the Hohen Lithograph building with architects Vigor Smead and developer Cross Street Partners. And now today's presentation. Jean H. Baker is Bennett-Harwood Professor of History Emerita at Goucher College. An eminent political historian and biographer, she is the author of Margaret Sanger, A Life of Passion, Sisters, The Lives of American Suffragists, James Buchanan, and Mary Todd Lincoln, A Biography, among other titles. And today's discussion will draw from her new book, Building America, The Life of Benjamin Henry Latrobe. Please add any questions you have for Jean in the Zoom chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. And with that, take it away, Jean.
Okay, thank you. Oops. I don't want to leave the meeting.
Click there.
Yeah. I do want to say a few words before I begin with my slides. And the focus of this talk is on Latrobe in Baltimore, but we have to get into Baltimore. He first saw what was then what we would call a small town in 1798. He was traveling from Virginia, where he had landed two years before, to Philadelphia. He wanted to look at the famous Walnut Street prison. It's sort of ironic that one of the first big public buildings that Latrobe would do was actually a penitentiary. In any case, his career in the new Republic of America, I think, had been meteoric. He had arrived in 1796, and 4 months later, he was having dinner and spending the night with George Washington, the great icon of our early republic. And then he got a public commission to design this penitentiary in Virginia. And so he traveled through Baltimore. He would not come back to the city to stay and to produce these two marvelous buildings that we will get to for another 7 years. I want to set the stage for his early life. And this is Full Neck, where he was born, back here. Full Neck was a Moravian community. I don't want to say cult, but these people and his parents were both stars in the Moravian church. They wanted to remove children from their parents. So Benjamin Henry Latrobe grew up as a child who really didn't know his mother and father. After he was weaned, he was put in one of these buildings with a whole lot of other young infants his age, and then he moved up to the bigger boys' choir, is what they called them. And eventually he was sent, because he was a very good student, to Germany to go to what we would call high school. But he rebelled, even though his parents, really much to their embarrassment, he decided that he did not want to be a Moravian, and so he went to London. There you are. This is Benjamin Henry Latrobe in London, looking to us, I believe, like a bit of a fop. He's gotten himself away from the dark, stern clothing of Moravians. He's supported himself by looking at translating some books and writing introductions to them. He's also studied architecture and engineering. Never forget that this was a man, a Renaissance man, who was not only a superb architect, but who also was an engineer. In any case, after a bit, Benjamin Henry Latrobe is in debt. This is going to be one of the great albatrosses of his life. He could never arrange his finances, and he was always investing in speculative ventures that came to naught. He married when he was in London, and his wife sadly died delivering their third child. And so he left London, came to Virginia, and began his career as a New World architect using neoclassical design. This is the building that made his reputation, the Bank of Pennsylvania. You could see how different it is from its neighbors. These are all brick buildings in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was the capital of the United States from 1790 to 1800. Everyone was agog when this Bank of Pennsylvania was finished in 1800. By that time, Latrobe had moved to Philadelphia. But we see some of the classic neoclassical signs of his design. And he loved low saucers as domes. And we see here an oculus, and the sun comes through here and is diffused throughout the mass of the building. This, as I say, made his reputation, but so too did his engineering. Benjamin Henry Latrobe designed for Philadelphia a watering system using a steam engine. We forget about what the great innovations of the past are, and certainly the steam engine was one. Latrobe set up a system where water would be pumped from the Schuylkill River into eventually the houses of Philadelphia. In 1803, Benjamin Henry Latrobe became the principal architect. He's not the original architect of the US Capitol. It is and remains a multi-authored building. But here is Latrobe's vision of what the US Capitol should look like. Again, the low saucer dome, the columns, and just a building that is simple and yet quite elegant. I think it's so sad today. We've, of course, added the wings onto the north and south, but I think it's sad today that we can't go in to what is now Statuary Hall. It's for security reasons all blocked off. In any case, what I am trying to emphasize is that by this time, Benjamin Henry Latrobe is the most famous and revered architect in the new fledgling United States. And he looks like it. This is the Rembrandt Peale portrait of Latrobe, and he has a resolute look in his eyes. It is one of the ironies of his life that he was an architect, always drawing, but he couldn't see very well. The glasses are an essential part, and there are several episodes in which Latrobe can't find his glasses. He breaks them. The kind that he liked were the only produced in England. In 1805, Benjamin Henry Latrobe becomes the architect of a great building in our city, and that, of course, is the Basilica. I want to get, I guess, to it. This is perhaps for some of you an unfamiliar look of our basilica. We are so accustomed to seeing it from the outside that we forget the real intricacies of his design. This is a double shell, and here's the oculus. The light comes in and floods what church historian architects call the choir. It's a double shell, and Latrobe all his life was interested in the play of light and dark. In an era without artificial lighting, it was a very consequential function of his architecture. Here we see coming in through the darker entrance, and this, by the way, was not finished until the 1840s, but one enters this very airy, light cathedral, so different from those in Europe. But in terms of its building, it was a very difficult project for both Bishop Carroll and for Benjamin Henry Latrobe. He had first been shown early plans by William Thornton. Latrobe was the kind of architect who, I'm sure this isn't true today, despised anything by any other architect. And when Bishop Carroll asked Benjamin Henry Latrobe for a second opinion, he got one. Latrobe thought it was heterogeneous, it was insipid, and he presented to Carroll two plans that Carroll might choose for this basilica. Happily, Carroll, who was as ambitious for a great building as was Benjamin Henry Latrobe, Carroll chose the neoclassical rather than the Gothic plan that Latrobe had proposed. But there were immense difficulties in the course of building this particular structure. The first was that there was a building committee that oversaw the plans, and they kept changing things. And one can imagine, or one knows from Latrobe's letters, the fury that he felt when ignoramuses, as he wrote once, were meddling with his design. Also, the Catholic Church ran out of money. And so the cathedral, what we call now the Basilica, was postponed for many years, and it started and stopped and then finally started again until it was complete in 1818. At that point, Latrobe wrote to his son John and explained that they were closing the scaffolding that existed in the dome. And apparently a group of Baltimoreans had walked up into somewhere where one could look down on the city. They had drunk a lot of punch, and they had shouted, "Hurrah, hurrah." And one thinks, in remembering that scene, that this is something that all Baltimoreans should say huzzah to. This is a great building, and it represents, to some extent, the ambitions of not just Carroll, but of the community and of Latrobe. Now, I want to move on to Yes. The second building that Latrobe left Baltimoreans was the Baltimore Merchants Exchange. This building represents the great ambitions of the city that by 1830 was the second largest city in the United States. We forget that as we drop down in modern times to lesser ranks in terms of population. The city, after the War of 1812, engaged in a process of expansion in every way. Roads were completed. There were more stagecoach to take you to other places. But the real key to Baltimore's economic life and to this merchants exchange is, of course, the water. Baltimore sat in this privileged position as the Susquehanna brought agricultural goods and iron down the Susquehanna and down the bay and into this protected harbor. At the same time, from the south, goods from South America, etc., were coming into the port of Baltimore. And so in this period well, it really began before the War of 1812, but it continues through the decade. A number of Baltimoreans, Latrobe used to call them the thinking men of Baltimore. They came up with this idea that they needed a multi-purpose building, sort of like an 18th century, 19th century mall. Everything is in this building. There is a custom house, which is absolutely necessary if you're dealing with international goods. There is a US bank. There are business offices for merchants. There's a United States Post Office. And believe it or not, this is, by the way, Water Street, which is now Lombard, but behind it is Gay Street. On the Gay Street entrance was City Hall until really 1870, when, of course, the new City Hall was built. Latrobe produced for these ambitious merchants a huge building. This is more than two, to get to the lexicon of today, football fields, 256 feet across here, and 100 and some along here. The intriguing part, though, is, of course, his hallmark, the saucer dome, which is available. You could walk up steps and you could walk out here, and you could actually look, if you were a merchant, you could look and see where your ships were. It was a fantastic contribution to the economic life of the city. Like the cathedral, it also had a troubled beginning and end. The troubled beginning was that Latrobe had asked his friend Maximilian Godefroy if they could be a joint team, not realizing then that he could never have an equal in terms of his design. So Latrobe went to Godefroy and said, we will put in a design together. They did so. Then, because Godefroy at this point is living in Baltimore, and Latrobe is still working on the restoration of the Capitol, which had been burned by the British, Latrobe says, all right, we will put in the design. And then the trouble began, because Maximilian Godefroy thought he was every bit as good as Latrobe, and he began tinkering with the design. He was in Baltimore. Latrobe at this point in 1816, 17 was living in Washington. And there is this huge, terrible fight. Latrobe ends up deciding that, which must be true, design is a monopoly. It is a statement, I suppose, of Lone Star architects that we have read about in Ayn Rand's terrible books. Sorry for that editorial comment. By 1818, the building is almost complete. And in some ways, it represents a bad time in Latrobe's life. He has declared bankruptcy in Washington. He was unable to fend off his many, many creditors. Latrobe is not a particular profligate in terms of his economic life. It's just that he was a speculator. He had taken on this American habit of investing in these terrible businesses, steam engines, etc., that went bankrupt. And so at the end of 1817, he's living in Washington. He declares bankruptcy. No one will pay his bonds. He was put in, as one did in those days, detention at night. The system was that you were free all day, and then at night you had to go into detention, which in Washington at this time was, they used a tavern. So the hardship was not so great, but the humiliation was. And in 1818, when this building is near completion, Benjamin Franklin moves to Baltimore. He lives in our city, although we have many, many Latrobe residual names all over the city, not his building, but the result of his grandson. He lived in Baltimore only 8 months. He left for New Orleans because he had a contract for the New Orleans municipal supply, water supply, and he expected that he would move to New Orleans. And ever resilient, ever optimistic, he believed that finally he would become a rich man. I leave you with this little snapshot of a very complex and interesting figure. Latrobe's legacy to Baltimore was not only his architecture, and this building, by the way, survived until 1904, but he left his two sons. Benjamin and John lived in Baltimore. They were involved with the B&O Railroad, which is the next extension of Baltimore's economic life. And their John's son Ferdinand was a 7-time mayor of Baltimore. Latrobe had a sense of architecture doing what, to some extent, Winston Churchill meant when he said that we create buildings and then they shape us. Certainly, Latrobe's sense of what he wanted for Baltimore and for the United States were great buildings that inspired humanity. So now I hope you'll think of a few questions, and while we're waiting, should we do this? Press it?
Yeah, that's zoomed in.
Yeah.
You don't...
This is from the digitized map, and it's the image of what the folks at UMBC thought was the status of the cathedral in 1814. And here is this, it's down in here. Here is this magnificent recreation of Baltimore. So I hope you have some questions or comments or disagreements or whatever.
Thank you, Jean.
Thank you, Jean.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I can't hear. Comes to stop my video.
Hey, Margaret, we can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, it was giving me alternating messages between using computer audio and phone. Question, Jillian. Can Dr. Baker point to where the basilica is on the 1814 digitized map?
I didn't hear what
She wants you to point at where it is.
Do you have an idea of where it would be?
So that we have a way of doing that. Should we expect the sophisticated? This will take a minute,
Sure.
but we can show you exactly where it is. Glad you asked that question. This way, this way.
I tell. There.
There. Now, if we go back, can we go back?
Mhm.
You can see where it is.
Oh, wow.
Now, while we're doing that, before everyone leaves, I need to give a shout out for the Peel. We'll go and see the Peel as well. There are a group of us, including who are working on, I guess it's this way. Have you all seen this map? I don't see where the
Yes.
Peel is.
Another
Anyway,
question has come in. Sure. Is there any
Okay.
evidence that Charles
Here's-
Carroll, sorry, go.
There's the Peel, and I'm giving a advertisement for there are a group of us working on its restoration as a building, and it's of course closed right now, but it is going to be a great contribution to the cultural life of Baltimore.
I agree. Is there any evidence that Charles Carroll of Carrollton was the singer involved with the building of the church?
Signer.
And
No,
if you don't
not
mind,
that I know.
can you exit out of the map? It is taking up a lot of bandwidth and the audio is coming up fuzzy. So
Okay.
or just stop screen share, that works too.
And
There
get
we
out
go.
of share. Yeah.
Yeah. So Charles Carroll, was he a singer involved with building the church?
Signer. Singer.
Signer. There's a typo. I think this.
Oh, Signer. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. But as an historian, I have often been proven wrong when I make declarative statements like that. There is very little evidence that no one besides Don Carroll had the notion of making Baltimore as a center of the Roman Catholic Church. And in the records, we see Carroll, who's most of his life after he left the family property was spent in Europe. And we see even when he's in Europe, he has this idea that the United States must have a different form of religion. It must accomplish what has not been done in earlier cultures and societies and nation states. He's terribly interested in, of course, the First Amendment, which became a part of the US Constitution in 1795. He sees that as the blank check for a religion that has been, to some extent, persecuted throughout Europe. And so when he is invested as the Bishop of the United States, he comes with these positive ideas of a Roman Catholic Church for the Republic. I have absolutely no evidence of Charles's impact on the actual building of the Basilica.
Okay, thank you. How did Latrobe's venture in New Orleans work out? Did he die poor?
How did his venture in New Orleans work out?
Oh, terribly. It was almost finished. For the first time in his life, he actually was living in a house that he owned part of. And then he got bitten by a mosquito and got yellow fever. And as his son had also died in New Orleans of yellow fever, he died in 1820. He had gone to New Orleans to make its water system safer. He had died because these special mosquitoes proliferate in water.
Mm-hmm. Wow. What happened to the Merchants Exchange? Was it destroyed in the 1904 fire?
The United States government bought it and ran it briefly after the Civil War. It survived when the merchant economy of Baltimore was flourishing. After the government bought it, it went downhill in terms of renovations and improvements. By 1890s, it was somewhat of an albatross. And in 1904, it was torn down. And as you all know, knowing downtown Baltimore, it has been replaced by parking lots and I guess a couple of restaurants and a hotel or two.
Right. And last question before we sign off for the day, could you talk more about Latrobe's watercolors?
His
Watercolors.
Watercolors.
Oh, there's a new book. You must know about the new book. There's a new book that I am reviewing this very moment about his watercolors that makes the argument that, first of all, his watercolors were much more important to understanding his career than we've ever suspected. And secondly, argues that when Latrobe came to the United States, he wanted to be an artist intellectual. Latrobe himself said, and the author admits this, that he was not a very good watercolorist and he was an amateur. So I feel that this is a really interesting and beautiful book. If some of you want books that are not just cocktail party books because they look good and they have great images in them and great reproduction, but has a fascinating text to go with it. Thank you all.
The book.
Reciting.
What is the name of the book? Is it out yet?
Yeah, I've got it right here. I'll put it up on the screen. Will it show? It's written by Julia Singowitz. You can see all my notes. Singowitz. And the title is Epic Landscapes.
Okay.
And she really makes the best case that can be made that Latrobe's watercolors, which he didn't think much of, really are far more important to understanding his career than we have ever suspected.
Awesome. Just a reminder, her recent book is Building America, The Life of Benjamin Henry Latrobe. And thank you, Jean. This was a great presentation and we were happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.